funerary figures are my thing. I absolutely adore them. I did my MA in Swansea University at the Egypt Centre, where I first encountered these gorgeous figures. I loved them so much, I decided I was going to keep studying them for my PhD. So on the theme of change, I thought it would be really nice to look at the ways in which sometimes things aren't always as they seem. When you arrive in a museum, you see a provenance label, we know exactly where it's come from, it's all great. Actually, things might not be as we first thought.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but we can't hear you again. Sorry. The microphone is turned off.
Hello,
okay.
Can you hear me now?
Right now, yes. Thank you, sorry.
Sorry to everybody for this awful camera angle you've got here. I'll try and remember you guys are here. So, to give a little overview of where this research started, I started with my 70 figures in the Egypt Centre. They had no provenance whatsoever. We had no idea where they were from. They were all isolated figures. I decided to try and create a kind of typological study. And I know a lot of archaeologists recoil in fear when you say typological study, but it's really, really good way of just giving us some ideas of where these objects may have come from and the ways they may have been assembled. So I've contacted around 170 museums in the UK at this point. There's quite a lot of collections with Egyptian material, it turns out, in this country. Around 50 of them so far have got wooden funerary figures, and I'm estimating I'm going to end up with around 1,500 figures in total. So if you look at this little boat here on the table, each one of those counts as an individual figure in my catalogue. I ought to tell you what a funerary figure is, really. So they're little tiny wooden figures. They're normally not much bigger than 60 centimetres. They're found purely in a funerary context. They're usually in with the grave, on top of the coffin, and you sometimes get little statues of the deceased as well. So far in my research, I've got about a 50-50 split of provenance and unprovenance material. So this is giving me a really, really good corpus to look at. However, one thing I wasn't expecting when I started my research, these provenance examples, let's see, we'll move on. If that's okay, please. So this lovely little chap is from the centre of the museum. You'll be seeing lots of pictures of pretty little faces. Changes continue to occur to objects past the point of excavation. We're not just looking at these things as this is its function in the ground. It has a whole object life cycle that continues way past the point of it coming out of the ground. The way it's been dispersed affects it, the way that things have been distributed, the way it's been interpreted by people with different areas of expertise. This is all going to affect the way we look at these objects. And if these changes aren't recorded, over time they become fact and they're not questioned. So I'm trying to really dig into the details of these figures. If I could have the next slide, please. So the best way to do this would be to give you a case study. This beautiful model boat you can see here is from the Year Museum, which is part of the University of Reading. And I'd like to say a big thank you to them for letting me to come and see this figure. This was one of the very first boats I went to examine. You can see from the picture, we have 9 figures on it. It's from Beni Hassan. We know it's from tomb 707. It was excavated by John Garstang's team in the early 1900s, and it dates to the 12th dynasty. Perfect, provenance, we know everything we need to know about this. I would recommend, if you're into that sort of thing, this book has a Wikipedia page. There's a little QR code you might be able to see. If not, I will pop the link in the chat for you once I finish my presentation. But do check out this museum. It's absolutely wonderful little collection. A lot of classical material, really, really worth a visit. Can I have the next slide, please? I always like to include a timeline just so we know where we are. These models were created nearly 4,000 years ago, and we have no information to indicate otherwise. We're assuming it was buried as part of the burial goods, and there it lay for 2,000 years. Reuse does occur, but there's no evidence of this at Beni Hassan with these particular tombs. Fast forward a few thousand years, John Garstang and his team turn up in the early 1900s and excavate the site. Through the process of dispersal, these objects have been distributed across the world, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And this particular boat was donated to the Institute of Archaeology in Liverpool. Later on, in 1923, Percy Thor bought this boat for part of the teaching collection at the University of Reading, which later became the Year Museum. And I know the lovely Jane Holly, who is Assistant Curator of the Year Museums, in the chat, so I will refer to her for any questions on the collection as a whole. If I could have next slide, please. So let's look at this crew individually. By isolating these models into individual figures, we can really start to assess them a little bit better. We've got 9 figures in total. We've got 3 pairs of rowers. We have 2 standing figures. At the back of the boat, you have the helmsman who's operating the tiller or the steering oar. And then at the front, you have the lookout who's mapping the way. So I thought a fun way of demonstrating this a little bit better, if we can go on to the next slide, please, Cameron. We're going to have a rowing race. It's not quite Oxford and Cambridge, but this seemed a really good way of demonstrating it. We've got the arrow at the bottom here that shows the direction of travel. And we have a competing team here from the British Museum. This came from tomb 723. The Garstang Museum in Liverpool have all the archival photographs of the excavation. I've been able to find a picture of this boat coming out of the ground, so I'm pretty confident this is the original composition of this boat. Let's play spot the difference a while. So we've got all the rowers, they're all facing backwards because you've got more strength to pull rather than push, so that all checks out. We have our helmsman sat in the back of the boat. Ours is standing in the Yale Museum rather than sitting. It's more common for them to be sitting, but it's not unknown, so that's fine, that checks out. My main concern here is our lookout. Can anyone spot the problem with our lookout at the front of the boat? He's looking the wrong way. Not ideal for a lookout. And also, if you look at the position of his arms, he's in a rowing position. You'd normally have the chap stood at the front, right arm pointing in the direction we're going. Watch out for crocodiles, that sort of thing. So already there's something not quite right with this boat. Some change has occurred at some point past the point of excavation. Next one, please. So the next thing I did was actually look at this boat in person. Pictures are great, online catalogues are fantastic, but you need to really get hands-on with these objects and really, really scrutinise the close details. First thing I spotted was an excavation number. Normally I love these. These are clearly the marks from the Garstang excavation, which tells us it's coming from Beni Hassan, and we have the tomb number on the boat. Fantastic. But we were told it was 707. So why is it saying 886 on it? It could read 998, depending on which way you look at the boat. But looking at the curvature of the numbers, I'm pretty confident we're going with 886. So something else has occurred here with the interpretation that we are just taking as fact because it said so on a label. Have the next slide, please. So the first thing I did was have a look. Luckily, Garstang published Beni Hassan with a lovely grave register in the back of the book, which has been my Bible for the last few months. And if we look, I think the top of the screen is missing, but this should tell us it's tomb 707, the tomb of Appa. And the first line, crucially, deposited by Sir John Brunner in the Liverpool Institute of Archaeology. This is the only one where it says Liverpool Institute of Archaeology. This isn't the case. A lot of material did go there. So perhaps this is where this assumption is coming from. Jane Holly at the Yale Museum was kind enough to let me look at their archival records. There's no evidence in their records, at least, where this assumption is coming from, but this seems to be the only thing I can find. We have a sailing boat and a rowing boat coming from this tomb. Fab, that would work. It's 10 figures rather than 9 on the rowing boat, but it's not impossible. One's been lost in the last 100 years or so. And you also have some other figures. This picture of the excavation of tomb 707 is a little tricky to see, so if I could have the next slide, please. Courtesy of the Garstang Museum, I've got some lovely pictures of the rowing boat at the top and the sailing boat at the bottom, compared to our lovely crew in Reading. You can see it doesn't quite match. The figures are stylistically a little bit different. So this is obviously not 707. Just to be really short, if I could have the next slide, please. I had a look at some of the other models that came from 707. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get my hands on any of them. The granary was destroyed during the Second World War, and the current location of the other boat, the kitchen scene, and the offering bearer currently all unknown. Fingers crossed, as my research continues, these may turn up. But if we look at the pictures from the archival record, we can see stylistically they're very different to the crew we're dealing with in Reading. They have much rounder faces and broader shoulders. It doesn't seem likely these are all coming from the same original tomb. If I could have the next slide, please. So let's move on to 886. If we've got that number written on the boat, that's probably where our crew comes from. That makes sense, doesn't it? But then if we go to our excavation report again by Garstang, we have remains of rowing boat figures, etc. Very helpful, John Garstang. Thank you very much. I would like to know how many, please, would be helpful. What do we mean by remains? But it's a clue in the right direction. Then I had a look around for other objects coming from this tomb. I was able to track down the coffin that came from 886. It's now in the Liverpool World Museum, and it came via the Institute of Archaeology. It seems to be common practice that as these objects left the excavation point, they tried to keep tomb assemblages together as much as they could. So I can't say for sure, but it seems likely perhaps this tomb assemblage all went to the Liverpool Institute and was then dispersed out. If I have next slide, please. So I'm happy to say the whole is that we're going to say that's from 886. Unfortunately, no photos of it coming out of the ground, which would have really helped my research. But then I hit another stumbling block. These four figures all have excavation numbers on the back, which normally would make me very happy. In this instance, none of the numbers match the number on the boat. So we have the first little chap here is from tomb 700, we have tomb 791, tomb 592, and tomb 112. So we have at least four figures coming from a completely different boat that is not the boat we're looking at. Something has happened somewhere. If I can have the next slide. So again, you see a pattern here. I refer back to Garstein's excavation reports in the grave register. Yes, tomb 700, 11 wooden figures from groups. So yeah, that checks out. 592, 11 decayed wooden figures and a number of fragments from boats. Yeah, this is good. 791, we have the site of granaries. We have some granary figures, but also wooden figures and fragments. Again, no numbers, but we're going in the right direction. And finally, 112 also has remnants of a model boat. I'd just like to point out in tomb 700, note that there's a canopy from a model of a sailing boat. I'll be coming back to that in a couple of slides. Next one, please. And one of our figures really has nothing to do with being on a model boat at all. And this is something, again, once you actually get these objects out and look at them and handle them, you see the things that maybe aren't quite right, a change has occurred. So this lovely little chap here, can you see in his torso, he's got a little notch. I'm referring to this as a scribal notch because I found it on quite a few figures that have been isolated. If you look at this lovely example from Edinburgh here, he has the scribal board inserted into that little notch and he has the nice flat back. He's a scribe, he's not a rower at all. He's got rower's arms though. These arms have been added on from another figure. And this guy you can just about see on his right is the gunwale, but the hole for the oar is on the other side. That should be on this side. And these are all tiny, tiny little details that once you start looking at them, it all starts to come together. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we're now on 5 of the 9 figures, are definitely not from this boat. Okay. But what do we do when we don't have tomb numbers on them? Even a lot of the Beni Hassan examples do not have tomb numbers, particularly when we're dealing with these isolated figures. So this is when the more analytical part, shall we say, of my research comes into play. The first thing I do is use a months or soil chart. Any of you that are archaeologists either love or hate these things. But I found a lot of the research will say, it's a reddy brown, it's a browny red. This isn't quantifiable, this isn't helping me. So I am recording the exact hue, value and chroma of the colour of the paint, which I can then compare. You would imagine if we were working on a site and we're making these model boats, we're taking ourselves back to ancient times when this object was created, we're not going to be mixing a very slightly different shade of red brown for every single figure. Common sense would suggest that we're going to just be using one tin of paint, keep going until we finish. Not the case for our York crew. We've got a really good mix of colours here. So this, the one highlighted in left is this little chap here, so he would be described as red paint. The other thing I've done is taken very careful measurements of all of these figures. I've recorded the heights, the widths, the size of the eyes, the lengths of the arms, just so I can make these kind of canon of proportion style measurements of them to see if there's any trends. So I've excluded the standing figures from this chart. I've just looked at the block figures, the little seated guys. And it's quite hard to see from the small picture, but there is a massive disparity in the sizes and shapes. It's over 10% in some cases. You wouldn't expect these things to be identical, they're all made by hand, but you would expect some kind of commonality as we go through. So there's clearly a good range of figures represented. The next slide, please. And the final thing I do is record stylistic traits. So this is things like the hairstyle, the shape of the eyes, the type of clothing worn, and these all can then be fed into my database, which I then use to pull out and find common trends. So just to point out a couple of examples, if we look at eyebrows present, we only have 2 that have eyebrows painted, the rest don't. Only 1 has a beard. Only 2 have nipples painted, the rest don't. there's massive disparity within this group. And once you start looking for these things, you really start to spot them. Move on, please. And the more places I've visited, this seems to be the rule rather than the exception. Almost all of the models I've viewed so far are complete composites. And when you start looking, this is obvious. Why did I not see this when I started? But you need to really, really get in and not just assume the label knows what it's talking about. Not to disparage labels, they are wonderful and they are brilliant, but we're going with the information that has been left in the archives without any justification for the reason we put it in it, which is causing the problems. So this lovely boat is from Bolton. This is also from Birmingham. Remember I said to remember the canopy from Tomb 700? Here it is. We have a lovely lady who's seated underneath the canopy, 522 on the back of her. And then we have 718 on the end of the lookout. And even just a preliminary glance at this crew, you can see they're all different colours. Some of them are wearing the fillets around their heads, some of them aren't. The facial shapes are very different. This seems to be happening quite a bit. Could we have the next slide, please? So the next question is when and why? This obviously didn't happen at the point of creation. I don't think the ancient Egyptians were putting on lovely numbers on the back to help us out. So it must be at least 1902 at the point of excavation. Looking through the archival records, there's no indication at either the Your Museum or at the Liverpool Institute that these changes occur then. It's always 9 figures, it's always described as seen. So my main suspect, I'm saying suspect because I'm still in the early stages of research, my lead suspect is Garstein and his team at the moment. If I have the next slide, please. I really recommend this wonderful, wonderful book. If you're interested in dispersal of collections and the colonial implications that come with this, Anna Stevenson's your girl. This is a fabulous, fabulous piece of writing. And she describes that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the majority of British expeditions going to Egypt and excavating came through these excavation committees. So these are places like the Egypt Exploration Society and the British School of Archaeology in Egypt. And they collect donations, which I'm going to say with bunny ears on. But in return for these donations from the collectors and the private institutes and the museums, they expect something back. This isn't really a donation. This is their subscription for their goodies. And through the process of dispersal, a lot of these objects arrive all over the world, including the UK. Looking through, and again, this is very early in my research, this is something I now want to dive into a lot more. Tomb models and model boats do seem to be a very, very popular request. People like things with people on, people like to see themselves in figures. And what's going to look nicer in your display case? A little broken figure with his arm missing, or a lovely, beautiful boat, or a lovely granary. People want complete models. If I have the next slide, please. There's some correspondence between the Petries and Guy Maynard, who was the director of Ipswich Museum. I've not had the chance to look at this correspondence in person myself. I'm going from a quote from Hickman Crittenden, who looked at some of the unseen images in the Petrie Museum. And this correspondence goes on and on with Guy Maynard wants a model boat and a group and a granary. And they say, well, you didn't pay enough money, so you can't have one, we haven't got enough. So he collects more money and sends a £30 subscription this year. And then when his box arrives, where are my models? And it seems to me that Hilda agreed they could have the models. William Flinders knew nothing about this and says, no, I never said anything, you were talking to me. It all concludes with Miss Petrie saying, I'm very happy to say that we've been able to repair a boat, granary and group. Repair, I don't like that word. What does repair mean? So this was occurring at Sediment, but it seems to be these models are coming from all sites across Egypt at this time. This seems to be common practice. So we've got our suspect, now we need to think of the motive. Why? What benefit to doing this? Next slide, please. So let's return to the scene of the crime. Let's have a look at Birmingham in 1902 to 1904. Again, the Garstein Institute have all these wonderful photos from the excavation that are really, really helpful. We have this lovely picture here of a little portrait going on. That's not what I'm interested in. What I want to look at are the other things going on in this tomb. So the tombs were often used as a place for working, for storage, even for sleeping when you're on excavation. These big tombs were the ideal location for this. So if I could have my next slide, please. So if we zoom in, on the left above, I've zoomed in slightly, you can just about see the model boat sticking out of the pile of stuff. And there's a few figures lying in front of it. On this other side, on the table, you've got a boat with a pair of legs sticking out of it. There's a few figures lying on the side. So what's going on here? What, is this just material that's come out and hasn't been processed yet, or is something else going on? Next slide, please. So a high proportion of these model boats have these pastiche crews. It's difficult to say how many, because obviously if there's no number and we haven't looked at them in great detail, we can't tell the extent to this goes on. But clearly something is happening, and it seems to be at this point when these objects are leaving Egypt. Got to think about why he would be doing this. This is obviously extra work for the excavation team. Why are they doing it? Putting two and two together, and I still need to find more evidence for this, the demands placed upon these excavators from the excavation committees must have been paramount in their mind. If we don't please the committee and their donors, we're not going to get funding for next year. Does it really matter if we kind of chopped a few models together? It's still a vote from Beni Hassan. All the figures are from Beni Hassan, so does it matter? My next question, and I don't have an answer for this, I put this to the room, is this a deliberate deception? I mean, the numbers are still on the back of a lot of these figures, so is that the way of the excavation team preserving this original provenance, or is it just the numbers were already on them from when we excavated them and we didn't have time to take them off? We don't know, but it does seem to be the case that this was done at the site as a means of keeping these donors happy. And you can understand why, it makes sense. The two numbers really help with matching this, but as I said, most of them do not have these two numbers on. So it's only through using these stylistic traits, which I hope to analyse over the coming years, to try and match back these crews together and reunite them. The other thing we have to be really aware of is these changes do affect the artefact. We're not looking at the object as it came out of the ground. We're assuming this is its original state. It's not. So when you guys next go into a museum and you see a label that says provenance and it's excavated, just look a little closer and just really check those details and make sure they are matching up. Have the next slide, please. So in summary, going back to our lovely boats from Reading, we have at least 5 of the 9 figures coming from different boats, with the vessel itself coming from another tomb again, possibly more. As I start to analyse these stylistic traits, I should be able to give a final number where we are. It does seem to be that this is a response to the demand of collecting habits at the time, which is a whole other presentation for another day, and the colonial implications of this really need to be unpicked as well, which I can't do in 20 minutes. We're using these clues, things like the excavation numbers, the stylistic features, the proportional measurements, and the images and archival records. We need to combine all of these. We can't just rely on one. We need to kind of do a more holistic approach and use a bit of common sense as well. Would they be using slightly different paint for each figure? No, common sense, you would just use one tin of paint and off you go. So we're trying to pull all these things in. I hope to be able to present more in the future and give you some slightly more concrete answers to this, but I just wanted to point out that these changes are not just happening in ancient times. It occurs all through the object's life cycle, and we really need to be aware of them. If I could have my last slide, please. So finally, I just want to say thank you to Birmingham Egyptology for having me today. Thank you very much, Cameron. Thank you, Valentina. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to the Year Museum for having me and letting me come and look at this amazing boat, which is really, this has been the impetus for a complete sidetrack for all my PhD research, because it's really interesting seeing the way these changes occur. And also a really big thank you to the Glasgow Museum as well, because they let me have a look at all their lovely excavation photographs, which have really provided the context of how these things came out of the ground and how they were being processed. Do follow me on social medias. I hate to do the horrible plug thing, but I do post lots of really pretty pictures. I'm out visiting 3 or 4 museums a week at the moment. I always post my favourite figure of the day, so do check it out if you like looking at this kind of thing. Thank you so much, everyone. Did I keep to time?
You're at about 10:32.
Oh, not too bad. Do we have any questions in the room before we hand back to Valentina? Yeah.
With you doing the paint analysis, how did you do that?
I am literally just looking at the colour. So a Munsell chart, if you've not used one, it's kind of like, you know, you have the colour samples when you paint a room, and you have all the slightly different colours, and you can put them up and see how they look in the room. It's a little booklet with all the slightly different colours in. So I can hold it up to the object and being consistent, whichever room I'm in, whichever collection I'm visiting, I'm making sure I'm reading it. There are more exact ways of doing this, but they are destructive. You're going to have to take a sample of the paint and a sample of the wood, which is a destructive process. I think this is enough to notice the comparisons. You've really got to weigh out whether it's worth using a destructive technique or not. And at this point, I don't think I need it. Good question, though.
Are there any other kind of techniques where you can sort of, like you've got like a lens and you can see through that and identify the types of paints that are used?
There are, but it's very time consuming. It's a lot of equipment. I'm already struggling to carry my little bag of kit around with me as I travel all over the country. So in the future, yes, if this does prove one of the best avenues to go down, I can definitely look into some other methods of doing a slightly more scientific analysis. But at the moment, this is enough just to give me a point in the right direction.
Because of the stories, like whether it's damp conditions or they're exposed to the sunlight,
Yeah,
because they use natural paints, that would also change?
it will affect them. But in the case of the Your Museum boat, you would assume because they're all on the boat, they would have all been in the same place and exposed to the same conditions. And that doesn't seem to be the case in this instance.
So you're concluding that they're really found in the same place?
I don't think they were found in the same tomb. They were definitely all found at Beni Hassan, but they were not all found in the same tomb. Any more in the room before we go to Valentina? Yeah.
So a lot of these boats you mentioned as being sort of composites.
Yeah.
Have you found the opposite at all when you've been looking through these figures, finding ones that originally were part of one context and then have been split out into different models?
I'm hoping to. So the way I'm compiling these 1,500 figures, all these stylistic pictures, it's a huge amount of data. So I've made a piece of software where I can use drop-down categories, pull all this information in. Once I've finished all these visits, hopefully by the end of the year, I'm then into analysis mode. So I'll be going through all the analytics and trying to match them up. One of the things I've included in my drop-downs is the tomb number where known. So for example, I know that canopy and that figure, even the ones in Bolton on one boat, the figures on another one, I can match them up virtually. So, and that's been one of the really, really rewarding things about this research. I've really, really enjoyed being able to pull in these things and just, even if we're not reuniting them in person, we're virtually reuniting them and knowing where their friends are. Any more questions in the room? Over to you, Canon, if we've got anything. Not Canon, sorry, you're over here. It's Valentina.
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations. It was an amazing presentation. It was so interesting. And in the chat, there are plenty of people who said, thank you, well done, congratulations. So it's not just my point of view. We have 3 questions in the Q&A. Marie Larmour asks, hi Sam, have you come across possible stylistic similarities that could point to individual workshops within your typological study?
Hi Marie, it's nice not to see you, but to hear your question. So it's really difficult to say. I'm definitely finding stylistic traits that match a site and a time period. So 12th dynasty Beni Hassan, you get these really big almond-shaped eyes. The figures coming from Sediment in the first intermediate period have this kind of helmet hairdo. I don't know how else to describe it really. I need to think of a fancier word before I write it up. But you do start to notice these trends. To identify an individual working, I think is going to be a lot more complex. Who knows? Hopefully, as time goes on, I'll be able to answer that question in more detail. But at the moment, I'm just sticking to a time period and a site.
Thank you so much. Arthur Farrow asks, were some of the boats and their crews put together from models that were already found in a broken or dispersed state within the tombs in which they were discovered, or might some models found complete have been improved?
Hi, Arthur. Yes, it's really interesting, and in particular going to the Garstein and looking at these images of the excavation, you can see the photos of these things actually coming out of the ground. And I think when you're very museum focused, you forget these objects come from an archaeological provenance. So in some cases, yes, they're still on top of the coffin, all neatly lined up like that lovely boat from the British Museum that was having a race with our boat. Other times, things are just scattered everywhere. It's wood, it's very friable, things get knocked over, there's movement over time. So a lot of the time you are just dealing with these big piles of wood. So there is going to be some interpretation on the part of the excavator. These things are then dispersed across the country. They're packed up in boxes and shipped. They're not going to be packed assembled. They'd all be disassembled almost like an IKEA pack. So we've all put together IKEA packs. It never goes in the place that it says it's going to. So that could be how our lookout on the front has ended up the wrong way around. There's all these opportunities to change over the object life cycle. So yeah, it's it's definitely a bit of a mystery to be unpicking. I think I'm going to have enough work for a good couple of years.
Thank you. Barbara Penlow actually asks your standpoint on our topic. If multiple people are involved in a manufacturing shop, stylistic variations may arise without it implying anything. Any comments?
Barbara, I knew you'd have a question on manufacture for me. Yes, it's really, obviously, as I pointed out with the guy with the tin of paint, using the same paint, thinking about it practically, you're going to have individual flair, you're going to have different ways of producing these things. It could be the end of the day and I'm really, really tired and I'm just going to whack this figure out, whereas at the start of the day, I'm all keen and I'm going to really, really focus on the details. So it's really important. Yet the science is great, the science is important. We need to also think about these as people doing a job. We've all had days when that'll do, we'll stick it in. But again, we haven't got any proof of this. We can't go back and actually see this manufacturing process, but it's definitely possible you're going to get these kind of discrepancies, especially with small figures like these. Things like the big stone statues, they're much more rigid in the canon of proportion of making sure everything's carved exactly right and facing the right way. Have a look at my Facebook and Twitter feeds. There's so many different expressions on these figures. There's definitely somebody's having a laugh at some point and putting a silly face on some of them. I just know it. I just know it.
Thank you so much. Since we have more time, there's another question, so I would like to ask this one as well, from Georgia Baker. Thank you so much, Sam. Many sites have not been as well documented as Beni Hassan, particularly for the tomb assemblage. How do you think this type of research can be achieved for models from sites with less documentation?
Hi, Georgia. Nice to virtually see you. You probably know more about this than I do, actually. It's really, really tricky. This documentation just doesn't exist, which is like, as even with the Garsteins, which has been published for Beni Hassan, you have the tomb numbers and you have the grave registers. These aren't 100% accurate. There's discrepancies. And even when they are correct, we have things like remains. This doesn't really help us. It gives us a clue. It's really, really hard to unpick it. And the archaeology of museums is becoming more and more of a thing. We really, really need to start going through our archives, going through these old photos, and playing detective more than anything else. We really, really need to start looking into these fine details. A lot of it is an assumption, but is an assumption better than nothing? It's really tricky one to call out.
If you want to remain in the schedule, we have, I think, 5 minutes left. So Arthur actually had a sort of follow-up and other questions. Might different artisans have been responsible for different parts of a boat models? One for figures, another for the boat itself, etc.
Really good question, Arthur. There's some brilliant research by Gerson Eschenbrenner-Diemer, and she looks a little bit more at the manufacturing sites. So I'd probably signpost you there. It's really, again, as we've said with some of the other questions, we can't go back and actually see these things being produced. There is no word for model in the ancient Egyptian language that we know of. They don't seem to be mentioned in any of the texts. There's no way of knowing what happened. Again, we have to just use our assumptions, but we have to be really careful with that as well. A lot of the interpretation of these models, you get female figures that are obviously concubines, which we now turn our noses at, and we have to be really, really careful whilst looking at the human side of these people, not to put our own prejudices and our own preconceptions on them. So it's a very, very delicate juggling act.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation and all your answers.